We're ready to go. Hello, my name is Barbara Bonner. I work with Clyde Hill Publishing. We are in Seattle, Washington. We are co-hosting this event with Chop Suey Books, which is in Richmond, Virginia, where Dr. Crutcher currently resides. Clyde Hill Publishing is a publisher for thinkers, tinkerers, and thought leaders. We like to tell untold stories and lift up voices that are traditionally not heard in publishing. With us today, we have Dr. Crutcher, of course, and we have DJ Lee. DJ graduated from the University of Richmond, where he majored in business administration with a concentration in finance and mathematics. He was also part of the baseball team. He played throughout his time at the University of Richmond. And he has been drafted to continue playing baseball now that he's graduated by the Oakland Athletics, which is pretty fantastic. So he will continue that in the spring. And in the meantime, he is working for a consulting business in Richmond, Virginia, where he works on financial analyzing and analyzing data. And so Dr. Crutcher was and is DJ's mentor during his time at the University of Richmond, and they have continued their relationship. So we will be listening in on their conversation to celebrate the launch of this fantastic book. So DJ, go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Barbara. As Barbara mentioned, I was lucky enough to be part of Dr. Crutcher's mentoring group while we were at Richmond together. And during that time, I was able to learn so much from him and really get to know him. And I will say, from all the things that I had learned from Dr. Crutcher as his mentee, I learned a lot more just from reading his memoir. For those who don't know, Dr. Crutcher is a wildly talented, courageous, and sensible leader, and one of the most admired leaders in American higher education. And without further ado, Dr. Crutcher is here for us. Dr. Crutcher, is there anything you'd like to say before we dive into some questions?
Well, first, just thank you, DJ, for agreeing to do this. DJ was actually in my first cohort of mentees here at the University of Richmond in 2015. And before we get started, I also would be remiss if I didn't thank, I see so many relatives and friends on here tonight. So thank you for coming out to support me. I'm most appreciative. So DJ, let's get started.
Absolutely. All right. So to begin, could you tell us a little bit about, where the title of the book comes from and why you decided it was an appropriate title for your memoir?
Sure. Well, as you will discover when you read the book, the title, while a lot of my friends have said, oh yeah, I've heard that's happened to me before. It's taken from an incident that happened in 1997 when I was head of the School of Music at the University of Texas. To be quite honest, it was not the original title that I intended for the book, but it was part of my story, and I have to give credit to my editor, Claudia Rowe, who's here, and to Greg for pushing me, because I initially didn't want to make the change. So here's the story. In 1997, I was head of the Butler School of Music at the University of Richmond. I traveled to Houston, Texas, to meet with an oil executive, CEO of an oil company, who happened also to be the chair of a foundation that provided scholarship money for violinists. And I had, for many years, wanted to get money from this particular foundation. I had worked hard to get the appointment. It had taken about a year and a half, 2 years to get it. I walk into the guy's office, I shake his hand, and literally as I am on my way to my seat, he looks at me and he said, I had no idea you were Black. And so as I am descending to my seat, I'm thinking to myself, okay, that's an interesting way to begin the conversation. I was a little offended by it, but having been taught by my father that when someone says something that kind of knocks you off balance, don't respond right away, take a deep breath. And so I did that. And then he went on, he said, perhaps you can help me. My wife and I have been going to the Aspen Music Festival for 30 years, and we rarely see any Black violinists. Why is that? So we then began this really wonderful conversation about why that was, what we were doing at the University of Texas, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, we got some money for the violinist. Actually, the person I was interested in that I was telling him about was a woman who had been at the Cleveland Institute of Music when I was there. Her parents moved back home to Texas. She came to UT Austin to work on a master's degree, wasn't really sure what she was going to do. And she's now in the Cleveland Orchestra. She changed to viola. So that's the provenance of the title.
Wow, that's crazy. There are a few different examples in your book where like people said something to you that kind of like caught you off guard. How have you dealt with like challenging situations like that when people say something that, you know, catches you off guard or maybe even offends you or creates an awkward situation, specifically like regarding your race?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I mean, when I was younger, it just was so kind of off-putting that I usually wouldn't say anything, or I would, you know, change the subject. But over the years, you know, as I've gotten older and wiser, you know, I found a way, you know, to say, did you really mean to say that? Or I tell you one thing that has happened very recently, and that's it's around not just my race, but just seeing color in general. I was sitting down, this happened within the last year, sitting with a parent who was a donor, and he was going on about how wonderful the University of Richmond had been for his daughter, and how much respect he had for me. And then he somehow got into, but you know, Dr. Crutcher, we raised our daughters not to see race. And when he said that, I thought to myself, okay. And the fundraiser was sitting to my right, African-American young man. And I said, I can't let this pass. And so I said, let me just make this comment to you. And I hope you won't be offended. But when you say that to me, you're telling me you don't see me. You know, I'm a Black person. So if you tell me you're raising your children not to see race, then you're telling me you're raising them not to see people who look like me. And he said, I've never thought of it that way. He said, you know, and so I thought I was being, you know, very liberal, trying to help them to be open-minded. And I was saying, well, just think a little bit about it. Look from my perspective as a human being. And we had a pleasant conversation. I thought my fundraiser was going to have a heart attack. But, you know, once he saw how the guy responded, and we already had the money. Actually, I was meeting with him to thank him for having given us the gift. But he said, I wish I had this conversation with you many years earlier.
Mm. Oh. Yeah. And that's what your book is here to do, right? To offer your perspective to people now. And, you know, now's just such an awesome time for people to hear this message. And specifically, your book talks about higher education and how higher education can help us navigate some of, you know, what you call like the knotty and complex social issues that our country faces today. Could you share a little bit about your thoughts on just the political polarization and how colleges and universities can help ensure the health of our democracy?
Absolutely. And let me just share with you my perspective. I mean, in my opinion, particularly residential higher education institutions, but I would say any higher education institution, but particularly those that are residential, provide opportunities for students that may in fact be the last time in their lives when they can learn in a safe kind of environment how to interact with people who have different political perspectives than they, who come from different cultural backgrounds, who have a different race and a different ethnicity. And let me just have you think about this one data point. In 2016, the Public Religion Research Institute found that 91% of whites in the United States have only other whites as their primary network, if you will. They found a similar, higher than that for Republicans versus Democrats, 83% of Blacks, by the way, and 63% Hispanics. So when students come to colleges and universities, they're coming from communities where most of them have not likely had opportunities to learn how to develop relationships or have conversations with people who come from a different political persuasion, a different religion, a different background, a different race than they do. This is our opportunity then as at a university to help them, to look at the university as kind of a crucible for helping young people learn how to live in a democratic society. And a society in which they also, and a situation in which they also learn how to have full-throated discussions with people around controversial issues, but to do it in a way that that's respectful. And DJ, you've heard me say this. I always say, when you sit down with, as a student, you sit down with someone who has a different perspective from you, the purpose is not necessarily to change that person's perspective or change his or her mind. The primary purpose is to listen carefully so you can have a better understanding about why that person holds those beliefs. They may change their mind, you may change your mind, but that's not the primary purpose. Mm-hmm. The primary purpose is for a deeper understanding. And you know, that person, you may not want to have that person as your friend, and that's fine. But you ought to be able to have a conversation with them that's respectful.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
And excuse me, but DJ, and I would say, you know, at no other time than right now do we as higher education institutions need to be educating young people, helping them to develop the tools and the resources to practice so that they have the muscle to be able, the intellectual muscle to do this kind of thing than right now when we live in a very polarized country.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so many times we like challenge ourselves to have conversations with people that we might disagree with. But I'd love to hear like kind of what are your steps for dealing with people's opinions or perspectives that really like to your core challenge your own opinions and perspectives?
Well, I think the first is listening to get a sense of, you know, where they are coming from. And the intention there is to try to find some way of understanding. But then there are times when that doesn't really that doesn't happen. And so what I do is I ask a lot of questions because to go deeper, you know. And a lot of times when I ask questions, after a couple of questions, people are stumped. They don't know what else. I don't know what else I can say. You know, you don't get it. But you know, just help me understand where you're coming from. You know, why is X, Y, and Z, or why do you believe X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, yeah. There's a great quote from your book that I'd love to read if you don't mind. Just a short passage, and you say the social problems America faces today are knotty and complex. Addressing them effectively will require more perspectives, not fewer. And university campuses provide an ideal environment to show the leaders of tomorrow how to navigate diversity, rethink a position, or stay up late solving the world's problems emboldened by youth, pizza, and caffeine. I love the end of that. That was spot on, right?
Yeah, well, I couldn't resist putting that in.
Exactly. But yeah, you talked a lot about how, you know, coming to universities, we come from our own, you know, kind of bubble of life, and we come to universities and we get enlightened to a new world. But I'd love to talk about kind of your upbringing. You come from humble beginnings, and for a long time that embarrassed you, but not anymore, not now. If you wouldn't mind just talking about your childhood briefly.
Absolutely.
And how it shaped who you are today.
Surely. So I'll start by just talking about my mother and father knew each other as children. My father became enamored with my mother when he was about 13 years old. They both lived in a little burg called Peytontown, Kentucky, which is located between Richmond, Kentucky, and Berea, Kentucky. And my father lived in Peytontown, and my mother lived in a little section called Burnham Town, which was named after the 6 slaves when they, from the Burnham side of my family, when they got their freedom, they bought this land and they built this 6 houses, and the 6 houses were the little town. It doesn't exist anymore. My parents, migrated to Cincinnati, as happened to a lot of Black people in the South. And what I would say is that I lived in a household where, my mother and father complemented each other very well. Mm-hmm. My father was an in-your-face, very loud, brash. He talked like he just came off the farm from Kentucky. I mean, he used to pronounce asparagus, asparagus. And in the morning on Sundays, he'd wake us up. He'd switch on to like, get up, Mac, get up, Mac. I was so embarrassed by the way he talked. Whereas my mother was very refined. She was an introvert, very refined. She always corrected our pronunciation. But the interesting thing is she never, ever said, don't talk like your father. She never said anything about it. She would always just, correct us. I lived in we were a very disciplined household. My father was, in my estimation as a child, kind of a martinet. I mean, everything was very, every scheduled, and you had to do certain chores, and I didn't like it growing up, but I thank God for it now as an adult, because he instilled the discipline in me. Neither of them went to finish high school. My father had to quit at the 8th grade because he was the oldest son of 10 children on a tobacco farm, and his father expected him to work on the tobacco farm. My mother, I've learned a lot about my parents' courtship from my 96-year-old aunt, who has a mind like a steel trap. She remembers all these details. For instance, I always thought my mother followed my father to Cincinnati. It was just the other way around. My mother quit school, worked for a family, and the family moved to Cincinnati, and my father, pining for her, followed her there. They were married when they were very, very young. My mother was 19 years old. But my father and mother, the family was critically important for them. And so and being in the middle class was important to them. And so at the age of 3, they bought a house in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood where we were the only second Black family. And I'm sure they must have scraped. In fact, my father had to get a white man to get the loan, but that's another story. And the one thing I learned from moving into this neighborhood was that my father's friends criticized him because he was very helpful. Most of the people in our neighborhood were widows, Jewish widows, because they were older. My father would do things like, shovel their snow, mow their lawn, and stuff like that. And yet my father befriended them, and they were very, very, and his friends wanted to know, those people don't care about you, But my father's attitude was, I don't care. They're human beings, just like I am, and as long as they treat me well, I'm gonna help them out. We didn't have a car until until my little brother was when I was about 8 or 9 years old. We didn't have a television. The first thing we had in our house was a big radio console that also had a shortwave radio, and my father could talk to people all around the world. And they didn't talk about a lot of things, but my father had been in the Second World War in the Philippines and in Japan. And he was fascinated by what was outside of the world. There were 2 of us for the first 8 years, my brother, Larry, and me. We were 10 and a half months apart. And then 8 years later, my parents wanted to have a little girl, and they had another little boy. So we were 3 boys, very, church. My mother and father were active in the church. I joined Zion Baptist Church at the age of 7 years old. I was very active. I started singing in the church at the age of 6. And so it was what I would say about how I would summarize my upbringing is that, but despite the fact that I was very embarrassed by my father, I used to wish my mother could marry someone that was more like her. But what I knew every day of my life living there was that I was loved unconditionally. Mm. And that's something no one can ever take away from you. Wow. And despite, you know, everything that I disliked about it, you know, and when I started playing the cello, for instance, my father, and I actually choke up when I think about this. In 1962, my father took out a loan for $800 to buy a cello for me. Mm. Because my cello teacher had said I needed a new instrument. He'd bought an instrument a year before for $250. And he took the loan out and bought this cello for me, a cello I used all the way through Yale. Wow. So I feel very, very, very blessed. Yeah, humble backgrounds, but yeah, and I was embarrassed by it. Now I thank God that I had the upbringing that I had. Yeah, and then one more question just on your family before we jump into some readings. But you and your father were very different in a lot of ways. It seemed like your father really challenged you. How did he challenge you, and how did that help shape who you are today? Well, depends upon, okay. I mean, he would challenge me in lots of ways. Like once I came home and I had all A's and a B, and he said, "That's great, but what are you going to do about that B?" No, I mean, you know, my father challenged me in a lot of ways, because I realized in retrospect, my father wanted his children to be educated. He wanted them to be respected, because I think he felt to some extent people didn't always respect him. But you know what? He didn't give a damn. That was his attitude. You're gonna see me and respect me, whether, you know, even if I talk like I'm from the country. Uh-huh. And as an adult, I really respect that. As a child, it just embarrassed the hell out of me. Mm. You know, but you know, and the lucky thing, let me share this with you. The good thing was I lived long enough to be able to tell him how much. In fact, I'll share this with you. One day we were in Boston waiting for my wife, Dr. Betty Neal Crutcher, and we were sitting in the car, and I can't tell you what motivated me to do this, but I turned to him and I said, you know, what is it about your personality that made you want to continue to strive? So my father, like I said, didn't finish high school, got left after the 8th grade, but he eventually went back to school and became the first Black manager of the world's largest machine tool company. Mm-hmm. So he said to me, when I was growing up, my father told me, no matter what you do, even if it's just sweeping the floor, do it the best you can. But he said, I hated my father. I even plotted to kill him. And I turned to him, just instinctively, I turned to him, you know what? I hated you when I was growing up. He doubled over in laughter. And I turned to him and I said, but I thank God that we both lived long enough for me to tell you how grateful I am for everything you've given me.
Wow. Wow. That's incredible. That is, you know, just an awesome, just reminder of just, you know, we might not like our parents at the time, but looking back, you know, they're always looking out for our best interest, right? I think now would be a great time for us to jump into the book. I think that there are some passages that you wanted to read for us. I think now is a great time to do that. So
I'll read one. Yeah. So this is one from my childhood. As I said, we didn't have a car until I was 8 or 9 years old, and we were very active in the church, Zion Baptist Church. So I'm going to read this. It was on a Sunday afternoon coming home from church that I had my first encounter with overt racism. My parents, as I've mentioned, did not own a car until I was 8, so we took the bus to and from church. On this particular Sunday, we were walking up 9th Street toward the bus stop. Just as we rounded the corner, we saw the bus a few feet away. But instead of stopping, the driver smirked at us and drove by. In those days, all buses heading down toward downtown turned around at Fountain Square and headed back out to the suburbs. So we walked over a block or two and caught the same bus as it was traveling back towards Avondale. "Why didn't you stop?" my father yelled at the driver as we stepped on. "I know you saw us. Was it because we're Black?" I had never seen such a look on his face. The man behind the wheel glared but remained silent as my dad stormed to the back of the bus where we were already seated, a little scared, a little thrilled, entirely confused. After we got home, my dad sat me down with Larry and explained that as Black people, we would be treated inequitably by some. It would not always be easy to tell who was a racist and who was not, he continued. But about one thing, we should be absolutely clear. We must never, ever lower our expectation of fair treatment. We were as American as anyone else in this country with as much right to its opportunities if we were willing to work for them. The conversation left an indelible impression on my 7-year-old brain.
Wow. Yeah, I remember that passage really standing out to me, and thinking back to just like today. And I know you referenced in the book about how, you aren't necessarily surprised that racism still exists today, being only, a few generations removed from, slavery. And you kind of brought that back in today's, lens. You talked about, and you referenced today's cancel culture, right? And how that kind of goes against a lot of your principles and how we should be handling conflict. And you touched on it a little bit, about, higher education. But would you mind speaking to just your feelings and, again, like your perspectives on a topic like that?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, first, let me just talk about the racism. I mean, part of the issue really is that the United States of America has never really dealt with the underlying implications of slavery, segregation, lynching, all of that. We've never dealt with it in the way that, I lived in Germany for many years. The Germans have, until Brian Stevenson developed his memorial down in Montgomery, there was no direct ways for you to encounter, or few direct ways for Americans to encounter the savagery of what happened to Black people in earlier days. And in Germany, they have these things called Stolpersteine, which are called stumbling stones. And they're little pieces of concrete on top of which are metal plates with the names of the Jewish individuals who lived in the house in front of which they're located. And they're intended to remind people of the Holocaust. And there are other ways that Germans have, and I'm not saying Germany has done this perfectly, they haven't. But my point is, we haven't even tried to deal with what happens to people at the subconscious level, not just Black people, white people as well. And I think over the years, as we try to as we try to deal with our country, and we see every now and then just like January the 6th, I wasn't shocked that it happened necessarily. It's happened in the past. Mm-hmm. 1874 in New Orleans, Louisiana, and many other examples. I do think, though, there is an extent, this is getting to the cancel culture that you were talking about, that we have in the last few years, I think young people, university students in particular, in terms of helping them to deal with the knottiness of systemic and cultural racism, in many ways, faculty have coddled students of color in particular, in trying to help them avoid the hurt, if you will, that can come from some of these kinds of encounters.
Yeah.
And I think our role should be not necessarily, our role should be, yes, we have to support the students of color in particular, in predominantly white institutions where crazy stuff happens, especially in the last 4 years. Mm-hmm. We have to support them And we have to say, yes, I feel your pain. But as educators, we cannot allow them to stay there. We have to help them figure out in some way, to look inside themselves, to garner up the strength to do something that counteracts whatever it is that they're concerned about in writing, in speech, in, you know, preferably not social media. No, social media can be included as well, but somehow to find their inner voice and inner strength so that when they graduate, we're preparing them for the real world. Mm. They're not going to have somebody necessarily to wrap their arms around them when they get into the real world. So we're trying to steel them, if you will. And I was just having a conversation with a colleague today about this. I mean, you know, I think a lot of times professors believe they are doing students a favor when they kind of say, oh, I'm so sorry you had to deal with that. Let me wrap my arms around you. And I'm not saying don't do that. We have to do that. We have to show them that we support them, but we can't let them stay there. Mm. We have to help them get beyond that. And to find and every person will have to find their own way, every student, their own individual way of looking inside themselves. It's not going to be the same for John as it is for Marianne or for Suzanne. But if we do not allow, if we don't steel them with that capability before they leave to go out into the real world, I feel concerned for them.
Yeah, yes, absolutely, absolutely. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the mentors that you've had in your life. And as one of your mentees, I'd love for you to share with our audience just a little bit about why you find mentorship important, why you continue to do, you know, mentorship groups and programs at your university.
Well, it's important for me for a number of reasons. I mean, for one, as a senior administrator, it's very difficult for me to teach a course. I haven't taught a course since 2006 at Wheaton College, and that almost killed me. I taught a first-year seminar. It's just very difficult because I travel a lot. But you know, I'm in this job because I'm an educator at heart, and I enjoy interacting with students, helping students grow, develop, and change. And the reason I enjoy that is that you know, I wouldn't be the person I am today were it not for many, many, many mentors that I have had. The first being Elizabeth Pottinger, my first cello teacher, who heard me perform 2 movements of a Bach suite at a competition at Miami University when I was 15 years old. I'd been playing the cello for 8 months, and she offered to teach me free of charge. She said, if your parents will get you from Cincinnati to Oxford every week, I'll give you lessons free of charge. And that opened up an entirely new world for me, the world of you know, higher education. She was very active in faculty governance. I learned a lot about faculty governance from Liz Pottinger because I would get the bus from Cincinnati at 7:40 in the morning, and I wouldn't come home until 6 p.m. So I was on that campus all day on a Saturday. She also introduced me to some important people in my life, my trio partner, Erica Klemperer. Another important mentor that I talk about in the book is Bryce Jordan. Bryce Jordan was the first musician to be president of a university. And when I was at the University of Texas, he was also the chair of our Fine Arts Council. One day in 1996, out of the blue, he took me to lunch. And literally, as we sat down, he looked at me and he said, "It's obvious to me that you're going to become a college president. Have you thought of the kind of college where you want to become president?" I was taken aback by what he said. I hadn't thought about it necessarily. And so I rather glibly said, "Oh, probably not a place as large as the University of Texas at Austin, probably a small liberal arts college." So after the luncheon, I thought, now, why did you give him that response? So I went to the bookstore and I went to the education section and I found a book called Colleges That Changed Lives, 40 schools you should look at outside of the Ivy League. And as I read the introduction to the book, it said, these are colleges that transform the lives of the students who attend them. And I thought, that's what I want. If I'm going to be president of a college, I want to be at that kind of school. So those are just two examples, but I mean, I have a whole list. So I'm trying to pay it forward. My parents were my first mentors. You know, the church, my minister was also a mentor. And then since then, I've had people all along the way to help guide me, even as a fully fledged adult.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a question for kind of some of the young people out there, people trying to, you know, still kind of find their way. But from, you know, meeting Professor Pottinger to choosing to, you know, play cello the first time, your life has been a series of events that probably seemed inconsequential at the time. And you kind of point that out in your book. But looking back, you can see that those events were actually creating the path to who you are today. And like I said, for the young people, what can we learn from that aspect of your life and those experiences?
It's the first thing I would say is take advantage of every opportunity that makes sense that comes your way. And even those that seem kind of, why would I want to do that? At least, you know, give it a try, because you never, ever know what's going to happen. I mean, the cello. I started singing in the church at 6 years old. I was a singer. I was in a gospel group. I sang in the best junior high choir in the state of Ohio. And one day the band director walks in and says, is anybody in here would like to learn to play an instrument? I raised my hand. I was one of 3 people. I have no idea why I raised my hand, except it sounded interesting. I went in, and that's how I got started with the cello. Wow. So take advantage, you know, and you know, sometimes it'll seem like, you know, I'm not sure I really want to do that. As long as it's not something that's, you know, going to put your life in danger, give it a try.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's incredible. So we are going to go over to questions here shortly. If you don't mind reading just one more passage from the book, and then we'll kind of take questions from the audience. And kind of like Barbara pointed out in the beginning, if you guys have any questions, feel free to raise your hand visibly, or, you know, by clicking under the reactions kind of tab at the bottom of your screen, you'll be able to, you know, raise your hand and we'll take questions from there. But first, Dr. Crutcher, if you don't mind just reading one more passage for us.
Yes, this is from chapter 8. It's called Alone But Not Lonely. It's about my experience in Germany. My decision to stay in Germany was nothing I could have envisioned at the outset of my adventure when I noticed people staring at me every day. But the change happened relatively fast. After living abroad for 6 months, I realized how pleasant it was not to constantly feel the need to explain my decision to become a musician. On the contrary, in Germany, musicians were revered. The parents of my students at the Bonn Music School treated me like royalty, often inviting me into their homes for dinner and presenting me with lavish gifts at Christmas or on my birthday. I loved the way Germans took time to enjoy each other during meals. They did not bolt their food, as is so often the case in the American homes. I love the sight of aging German hikers in their 70s and 80s who left me in the dust when I walked in the 7 Hills. Most of all, aside from my frustrations with music reviewers in Germany, I rarely thought about race. This surprised me, but it was only when I stepped away from life in the United States that I realized how much energy that topic had consumed. As a student, I spent an inordinate amount of time thinking about how people, particularly white people, were going to react to me. It was exhausting. In Germany, by contrast, I felt unencumbered. Other than those strange moments with the waitress at the Hotel zum Löwen and Herr Damenkuisen, race hardly came up with my colleagues and friends there. Many confided that they did not think of me as American. I spoke their language and had adapted to the European lifestyle. I was a citizen of the world now, and I'd never felt so free.
That's an awesome passage. There were actually a couple questions that I had for you about Germany, but I refrained, knowing that I would surely mispronounce a lot of the names and titles that you reference in the book. But before we go to questions, I'd love to just ask you one more. Yeah. And that's just if you would share just a little bit. I know we want to go over to questions, but a little bit about your time in Germany and how it made you, as you say, the American you are today.
Oh, wow, DJ. I wanted people to have, but what I will say is that I was very, very fortunate. I lived with one family for 3 years, and that grounded me. I often wonder if I had not had that opportunity. Not only did I live with the family, they had 4 sons already. I was their 5th son. She washed my clothes for me. She was American. She was from Wauwatosa, Wisconsin. And I learned a lot about intercultural relationships from them because he was a professor at one of the gymnasium there. I also learned, because this was 1972, and I like to stay connected to people who are close to me, calling them and writing them. And back in those days, the only way I could stay connected was writing letters or cards. And after a while, it was really, I felt a little bit out of sorts about it because I really couldn't call. And I won't go into all the details. You can read that in the book. But I actually came to the point about 6 months, 7 months after being there, where I realized what it felt like to be alone without feeling lonely. And that was just fine. That I was going to be just fine. In fact, I was reading Buddenbrooks at the time. And I was waiting for somebody to come and pick me up to go to a party. They were late. I walked over to the mirror. Don't ask me why I did this. I walked over to the mirror and looked in the mirror. And I said to myself, okay, what's the worst thing that can happen? You're enjoying this book. If you don't go to the party, you'll stay here and continue reading the book. It's a long book, Buddenbrooks. And I was just fine. And the other thing is that in terms of being an American, I really, as much as I loved living in Germany, living there helped me also to appreciate the United States of America and American folkways.
That's incredible. Thank you for sharing. I know I kind of dropped the bomb on you in the last 2 minutes, but yeah, I think we're going to open up to questions now. Barbara, do you want to take over with that?
Yes. Thank you, DJ. Thank you, Dr. Crutcher. As DJ mentioned, if you have questions, please either use the reaction feature down at the bottom of your screen or wave your hand. We appreciate you having some patience with our chat being unavailable at the moment. So we will go ahead and start. Let's see, who do we have? Anyone raising a hand? Oh, I see Alvin. All right, let's start with Alvin.
Alvin Scheck-Snyder. But I saw Claude Swan. I'll defer to you. I saw your hand first. Yes, I'll defer to you.
Oh, there
can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Dr. Crutcher, your career is a wonderful, wonderful testament to success. I mean, I stand back in absolute admiration. But no career is a straight line up. And I mean, for young people that I mentor, I like to tell them that the difference between winners and losers is not what you do when you win. Mm-hmm. It's what you do when you lose. And so sort of describe a setback you might have had in your career and how you've turned that around to continue to plow forward.
Wow. Well, what I can say is that I can share you one particular one that is in my brain right now. It was a presidency where I was a finalist, and everything had gone well. I just knew I had the position, and the search consultant called me and said that they had hired the other person. And so I said to the search consultant, what could I have done better? She said, nothing, you were just fine. What do you mean I didn't get the job? Surely there's something I could have done better. And what she said to me was that what you need to understand is that at this particular point, where you are in the search, it's not a matter you know, necessarily how good you are, if you're better than the other person. It's just a matter of, you know, how people respond to you and the fit. And I have to tell you, Ed, I was really angry at her because I didn't buy that at all. Except that, and in fact, after the call, what I did is that I called one of my mentors, Bob Berdahl, who had been the president at the University of Texas at Austin when I was there. He was at Berkeley. And I said, am I barking up the wrong tree? Should I be looking at other kinds of colleges or small liberal arts colleges, not the place? He said, absolutely not. And he shared something with me, which I've done with my mentees. And he said, and he started telling me the number of times he had been a finalist for a position. He got up to about 8 or 9 before he finally got a presidency. And so what it did for me was to help put that experience into context. And rather than giving up, because I was on the verge, I had said to myself after the conversation with her, I'm provost at Miami, I love my job. They would love for me to stay here and be the next president. I'll just stay here. But after I had that conversation with him, I thought, well, I'll be open. And guess what? The next interview I had, exactly what this woman said to me happened with the search committee. I had a meeting, it just clicked. And before you knew it, I was president of Wheaton College in Massachusetts. So the point is, you know, really, even when things even if the path you're on seems not to be the right path for you and there are roadblocks, just, you know, kind of step back. And I would always say, consult somebody you really, really trust, preferably a mentor, and then find another path to get another way to get around the roadblock.
Thank you.
Surely, thank you, Ed.
Yeah. Now, may I, Barbara?
Yes, please. I'll
well,
go ahead.
First of all, congratulations, Ron. I'm really excited and very happy for you. I've not read the entire book. The chapter that really captured my attention, frankly, is the one about family. And I'm so glad that you were frank about your dad. One of the things I'll forever remember is your dad coming by bus to your inauguration at Wheaton College, and members of your church. I mean, they filled the entire bus. I mean, that was really quite a statement. And that is something that I will never forget. It just speaks volumes about your dad, your family, and your church, all of which I know are very, very important in your life. One of the things that you mentioned in that chapter is something that brought back memories. In the early days of desegregation, I grew up in Louisiana. I can recall going to a restaurant. My dad had died. My surrogate father was my uncle. And we walked into a restaurant, and pretty soon the other blacks who came in wanted to sit by us. And he'd say, can't they find some other place to sit? And you mentioned your dad saying the very same thing in the book. I thought that was really interesting. But both at Wheaton and at U of R, you've had a real impact with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm one of those guys who's been around a long time, so I can recall the days of affirmative action, equal employment opportunity, and so now it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. As a leader who's put a lot into this sort of thing, what assurances do you have that when you exit left stage, that the work that you've put in will continue?
Mm-hmm. Good question, Alvin. Well, you know, let me tell you the way I have parsed the work that we're doing at the University of Richmond, and that is that, and as you were at the inauguration, as you recall, in my inauguration, I congratulated the University of Richmond for having become much more representationally diverse. But I said, that's just the first step. Once you have the diversity, you have to ensure that those who are in the community feel as though they belong, feel included so that they can thrive. And what I wish I had also said is that, you know, to get to that point where everyone is thriving is long-term work. It doesn't happen in 5 years. It doesn't even happen in 10 years. And I'm beginning to think now of the whole, you know, so yeah, we have a plan. We have a Making Excellence Inclusive plan at the University of Richmond. We've also taken an approach that doesn't include a chief diversity officer per se. We have what we call a distributed leadership approach, where we have someone on the president's cabinet who oversees things, but then that person works with the 2 executive vice presidents, and then we have an institutional coordinating council which serves as kind of consultants for the campus. And the goal is to embed those values across every unit of the university. And so, to get back to your question, the way that the work will continue after I leave is through this distributed leadership group, because no leader can, and unfortunately what happened first at the University of Richmond, everyone was looking at me as a chief diversity officer because this was one of the values that I held dear. But when you're dealing with something like the condition of systemic racism, it's not a challenge or a problem, it's a condition, like a medical condition that will take, you know, and a medical condition that will require remedies, long-term remedies that may never really cure you. Because I really don't think in my lifetime we're going to see the end of systemic racism, quite frankly. So what I would say is that for me, the people that I have worked with in this distributed leadership team will carry on the work. Now, their concern is, what if a president comes in and they don't really feel that diversity, equity, inclusion work is critically important for the university, or they look at the numbers and say, oh, this is a very diverse institution. Unfortunately, that's out of my hands. But I do know that I have actually would say this to a candidate, there are going to be lots of people on campus who are well schooled in the work and are familiar with the work that we're trying to do, committed and passionately committed to the work. So it will continue at some level.
Thank you, Dr. Crutcher. Dee Banks, did you have a question?
Dee had a question.
Oh, hi. Hi, Dr. Crutcher.
How are you doing?
Good. I just want to say, first of all, that Dr. Crutcher was also a mentor to my son, Matt Banks, who's a lawyer now, U.S. Marine Corps. And thank you so much for everything that you did for him.
Matt was a fantastic student.
Thank you. So I just have a quick question. You know, you and I have shared over the years our experiences in Germany and the influence that experience had on I was a little bit young. I mean, I was there at a younger age than you were. And I haven't read your book. I'm getting it on Thursday, as I said. Did the Holocaust question ever come up over the years that you were there? And I was just wondering if, you know, it's sort of hard to, I know when I was there as a family and with the experiment in international living, you weren't supposed to talk about it, but it was hard not to come up. And since you spent so much time there, I don't know that I've heard you make a comment about any conversation that you've had with your family.
Actually, and there's a passage in the book about that. The family I lived with, the mother was American from Wauwatosa, Wisconsin. The father was German. And several times while I was there, and Hans Werner is still living, he just turned 90, a Latin and history teacher at one of the gymnasium. And he would tell me about the fact that as a young person, he joined the Hitler Youth Group. Because, you know, back in young, they duped young people into thinking this was for, you know, the good of the country, et cetera. And then, you know, when he found out what they were really all about, because his father was a minister, he quit. But at times he told me this story. Well, sadly, he has Alzheimer's. He won't tell it to me again. But many times I heard this story. He'd be in tears because he was embarrassed and ashamed of himself for having been duped that way. That's the only direct you know, that's the closest tie that I will say in Berlin, you know, this Stolpersteiner thing I was talking about, what really impressed me was that every year, once a year, people in the community come out with candles and they shine a Stolpersteiner. And again, it's a way to remember what happened. But that Hans Werner, and it's in that same book, chapter 8, Alone Without Being Lonely. Please say hello to Matt for me.
I will.
Thank you. And I will say we are getting close to time. Dr. Crutcher has agreed to stay on just for a few extra minutes if there are more questions. But if anyone needs to sign off, I just wanted to say thank you for joining us. If you have not yet purchased a copy of the book, you can do so from Chop Suey Books. That's Chop Suey, SUEY books.com. They are local to Richmond, and they're selling signed copies that you can pick up in person, or they ship nationwide. And you can also buy them and learn more about our other titles on our website, which is clydehillpublishing.com. And you can follow Dr. Crutcher's adventures on Twitter. His handle is @RA_Crutcher. So I will.
Mark has a question.
Barbara,
Mark Johnson, I think.
Mark, go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay, everyone?
Yes, thank you.
Well, hello, everyone, and Happy New Year. And Dr. Crutcher, it's very nice to see you. I was delighted to get this invitation. I'm doing well, thank you. You know, at the expense of keeping people longer than perhaps they had anticipated, let me just ask you to maybe reflect or to look ahead a little bit, really, to the future of higher education. And what I'd like to do is really kind of localize my question to an imaginary student and ask you to speak a little bit on kind of what has to happen at the individual institution level or maybe at the kind of federal policy level to ensure that the aspiring or perhaps not even knowing kind of Ron Crutchers of today, right? Young students with talent, you know, perhaps in the art, but young students who could have a promising trajectory. What has to happen in order to ensure that they can find their way to institutions that will help launch their careers and hopefully a meaningful life?
Very, very, very good question. Well, one thing I'm going to just quickly refer to a conversation I had just this afternoon with one of our representatives. Today was Capitol Hill Day for the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, where we were lobbying him to work with us to double the Pell Grant, because that's one, you know, one vehicle to make colleges, universities affordable to students from all backgrounds. But you really have to start, obviously, way before that, you know. And so what I would say to you is that the main thing that has to happen is we, as a country, have to commit to investing more in our K-12 education system, and particularly those in inner cities. And because what's happening is that you see time and time in students, very, very bright students who in inner city schools who could have wonderful opportunities if they only had the opportunities, if you will. And I've maintained for many, many years since I first came back from Germany, I don't think somehow our country doesn't have the will to address this problem. It's not rocket science. We know any student who's born with a brain intact, as long as it's not, you know, it's not malfunctioning, can learn. We know that, but we have not committed to the kinds of investments that are necessary for all of our schools. For some of them, yeah, but not for all of the schools. I would also say, you know, in addition to the country making that, and mainly politicians, but we, the citizens, have to push the politicians to want to do this. One of the things that I thought of doing when I first stepped down from Wheaton College, when I thought I was going to be doing something else, was forming an organization of men, you know, really calling on people, friends of mine, and I was going to call it Each One, Reach One, which is an old campaign from the Black Child Development Center many, many years ago. And just for retired men of color to go into the schools and to take just one or two students and inner city schools, one or two students, and work really, I mean, work with them on all kinds of things, you know, not just your academic work, but also in some cases, you know, their self-esteem, take them to baseball games, to concerts. And I know, you know, there are various organizations doing that, but it's not deep enough to affect enough students. Federal policy, of course, could help for certain, but I just don't think we have not resolved to make the kind of commitment. And let me tell you what's driving me here. DJ asked me about my experience in Germany. One of the things that I learned being in Germany was watching my family. So my family, they had 4 boys. Their 4 boys went to one of the top Jesuit gymnasia in the country of Germany, the Jesuitenkolleg. My friend lived with a family that was a working class family. He worked in a factory. His wife was a stay-at-home wife. They had 3 children. There was a big income disparity, and yet little Walter, who was in Albert's household, had the same opportunity to go to the Jesuitenkolleg that my German brothers did because of a state subsidy. He got subsidy. He didn't have to pay as much as they did. He got a subsidy for the streetcar to get there, and it just doesn't seem like rocket science to me. I just don't think we have the will to do it, and it's such a shame because we're allowing so many really vibrant lives to go fallow or end up in prison, and you know, those are all human resources that human beings who are not going to fulfill their potential. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Dr. Crutcher.
Sandy has a question.
Actually, let's go to Linda first, and then we'll end with Sandy.
Oh, sorry.
And then we'll cut off so we don't keep you all too late. Linda, go ahead.
Thank you. Ron, we go back a long way, and you have been in higher education since I've known you at Miami. And my question is about the concern that systemic racism will not go away in our lifetime. And I think that you're probably right about that, which I'm wondering though, what may be different from 50 years ago at Miami, more than that, and now that might gives you hope and a positive look at how this might be resolved, maybe in our lifetimes, but something must give you hope.
Yeah, of course. No, I mean, you know, again, something I learned from my father. I'm a glass half full person. I can't live my life any other way. But I think, you know, all the events after the George Floyd murder last May, that still gives me hope, even though, you know, lots of stuff has happened in between. But I look down at what's happening. I look at, for instance, at our management roundtable right here in Richmond, Virginia, management roundtable made up of all the CEOs in the area, and they now, you know, have a commitment to being more proactive in this arena, in the social justice arena, which is critically important, but in real ways. Now, to be honest, the chair is an African-American friend of mine, and he put this on the agenda, and I participated. But what really I found fascinating was that people they were really genuinely interested in wanting to know how they could do better. So, you know, and so that gives me hope. because we saw the same thing, Dr. Betty and I, with our Parents Leadership Council, wanted to know, you know, what can we do with our friends? How can we start conversations? We want to learn more. We feel now that we've gone through our lives with blinders on, you know, and you know, we're like, there's an analogy like fish sleeping, you know, fish sleep with their eyes open. This stuff has been happening right in front of us, and we've been totally, you know, oblivious to us. And interesting, by the way, many of these parents, and these are our Parents Leadership Council, it's made up of parents who give money to the university. Many of these parents were awakened, if you will, or woke by their children. You know, so you know, I can only be hopeful, but it will take commitment. I mean, and you know, Black people we can't do it by ourselves. We have to have allies, and I think that they're more there, but we have to just kind of just keep at it.
Thank you, Dr. Crutcher. Sandy, we will end with your question. Go ahead. Oh, hold on. Let me unmute you real quick. Okay, go ahead, Sandy.
Not really so much a question, Ron. It's so good to see you, you know, over the years that we've run into each other time after time in Europe and other places. I agree with you that it takes personal commitment to reduce. Well, you know, I lived in the South for like 11 years. And when I was growing up, there were no people of color in my town, none. I don't think I knew anybody of color until I went to Miami. And you were one of the first people I met. And you were the most engaging, personable person of color or not with color that I met my first week there. And I think it takes a lot of that, the to person aspect of it. And we can't, working in such big groups, it's very difficult to challenge people's feelings and their reactions. But if you do it person to person and you're committed to doing that, I think that's a very big step forward.
No, I agree. And I can tell you last Wednesday, my church, St. James Episcopal, did a Wednesday evening session as they do every Wednesday. And someone interviewed me about the book. And they have a race and reconciliation committee that I'm serving on as a member of the steering committee. And that's really what they're using, intergroup dialogue, to help people from different backgrounds to understand. This is something that the University of Michigan, excuse me, has used for years. But you know, I think it takes commitment, it takes time, and it takes sincerity. And my goal is, you know, I want our students to learn how to interact with people who are different from them in authentic ways, right, to be real, you know, not superficial ways. And right now, what often happens when they come, because they don't have an experiential base from which to build the authentic relationships, it's all superficial. In fact, I'll share one last comment with you. One of Dr. Betty's mentees, who happens to be the granddaughter of one of my former trustees at Wheaton College. And so I called her and I said, okay, tell me, it's early on, what's it been like? She's from New York City, a very wealthy family. And she said, okay, do you want me to sugarcoat it or you want me to tell you the truth? And she said, well, I'm disappointed. The only people I've met here are rich white girls like myself. I said, well, you know, we are in COVID. That makes it a little more difficult. But I said, I'm going to challenge you. You need to work on your, you need to step
to reach out
and reach out. And if you join Dr. Betty's mentoring group, you know, you'll do that. And she has, she has. But that's the point. I mean, you know, it's easy to be around people who are, yeah, look, diversity and inclusion, I think is not, it's not about linking arms and singing Kumbaya.
Yeah.
It's hard work. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance there to interact with people who are very, very different from yourself. And I think that we in higher education didn't understand that, or certainly didn't focus on that back in the 60s. We just thought, open up the gates, let people in, we'll all be happy. Well, you know, it's hard work.
Yeah,
it's very hard work. And if you have to be committed to that. Thank you,
but
Sandy.
you make it easier.
I'll try my best. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Well, I think that is a fantastic note to end on, to reach out to your community, your friends, your family, your neighbors, and engage with them in thoughtful, open-minded, authentic communication. So thank you, Dr. Crutcher, for that. Thank you, everyone, for your wonderful questions. We really appreciate you being here. Again, if you don't have a copy of the book, you can get it from chopsueybooks.com or clydehillpublishing.com. You can also buy it from any of your favorite local bookstores. Just give them a call. I'm sure they'd appreciate your business. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. It means a lot to us that you wanted to hear this conversation, and we really appreciate it. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you so much, Dr. Crutcher, for writing this book and sharing your story with everyone. It's a hugely important story that needs to be told, and we so appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing it with the rest of us.
Thanks to Clyde Hill, and especially thanks to Claudia Rowe, my magnificent editor. She did a fantastic job. She pushed me, she cajoled me, but we got it done. Thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And DJ, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, DJ.
Thank you for having me. I definitely appreciated being here.
Terrific. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you so much.